Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the TurtleUp podcast. I'm your host, Dustin Holmes, and for today's episode, we are going to be interviewing a former TurtleUp intern on their experience working on a sea turtle tracking device. All right, before we get started, Austin no longer lives in the Dayton area, so that's why we are doing this episode over Zoom rather than in the podcast studio. So, Austin, could you introduce yourself and explain how you got involved with TurtleUp?
Yep. I'm Austin Grewell. I recently graduated from the University of Dayton with a mechanical engineering degree, and I got involved with the project as part of my senior capstone class. So UD engineering seniors take a class where they do a capstone project, and mine was working for TurtleUp to design a turtle tracker.
Did they ever go into, or did you ever research why the project was created in the first place? Like why we needed a sea turtle?
Well, yeah, we got some of that information when we started the project. Ours was mostly because turtle trackers already exist, but they were outside the price range for at least the scale that TurtleUp wanted to deploy them at. And building an affordable one would help bring that research further by allowing places with smaller budgets to deploy them and places with the budgets that could already afford them to afford even more of them. We did speak to a doctor at the University in Ghana who gave us some kind of project requirements for tracking the olive ridley turtle. What he wanted to look at was determining where those turtles go when they leave the kind of continental shelf area near the African coast, because they didn't know if it was the same population of turtles that also appears in the Gulf of Mexico and Caribbean Sea area, or if there was a separate population there. And seeing where these turtles go after they leave the coast near Africa was important, which is why we had our goal of keeping the tracker active for 6 months. So it would cover both the time that the turtles are coming to the beaches and laying eggs, all the way to the time that they return to the deeper waters in the ocean. One of the sensors we put on the tracker was a pressure sensor. And using this pressure sensor, we could determine from the water pressure how deep underwater the turtle is. We also had a GPS sensor, so we'd be able to tell where that turtle was in the world and when it had left those coastal waters.
So I know with some other trackers, they send pings like every day or every hour or things like that. Did you guys go that in detail and like determine how often it would update the location and things
and
like that?
And that was something we hadn't narrowed down specifically yet, is how often. And actually something we were talking about doing was a variable rate for those pings, so that when it's running low on battery, in order to conserve power, it could ping less frequently. So you get less frequent location updates, but a much longer lifespan, because the vast majority of the power used by the device was actually making those satellite transmissions. We were looking at starting with around once a week for ours, but it's also determined by the opportunity to make those satellite transmissions, because the turtle has to be on the surface at the same time when one of the satellites is passing overhead. So if that window doesn't line up for a while, it could delay those tracking updates.
I'm assuming you weren't planning on recollecting these GPS trackers after they would be put on a turtle. They would just like fall off eventually?
Well, it would, in theory, be possible to collect them, but it'd be very difficult, because if you're collecting it while it still has battery, then you could get one of those tracking updates, see that it's close to a certain beach, and then go out to that beach at night when the turtle's laying its eggs and look for it. But usually, if you're going to be collecting one of these devices, it would have to be after it's run out of battery, in which case there'd be no way to determine where that turtle is. You could get very lucky if you happen to be on the beach tagging other turtles or something and see a used tag that you could collect and fully download that information. which kind of brings me to one of the other challenges was getting that information into a small enough file size that it could be transmitted to a satellite quickly, because the amount of information that can be transmitted at one time is also limited. A lot of the stuff I did, I helped out a little bit with the programming, but I was mostly on stuff like case design and some of the sensor design and layout. Building a case that can withstand being underwater for up to a year, and varying pressure and sunlight exposure it's an interesting challenge.
Yeah, what were some of the difficulties with the case for it? Because I was wondering that myself, how you worked around the pressure, like what materials you might have used to make it, and how you make sure that it'll last for a full year.
Yeah, at first, in the first semester of the project, we were looking at using HDPE plastic. And originally we were going to vacuum form it, but the thickness that we needed to withstand this amount of pressure, once we got the material in, I got it ready on the vacuum former, and it didn't have enough, the vacuum former wasn't powerful enough or large enough to do that thickness of material. So I ended up cutting it down and melting the pieces of plastic together, which, while it worked for a functional prototype proof of concept, it was way too boxy for what we wanted to actually deploy. We wanted something that would be a bit more streamlined so it wouldn't interfere with the turtles swimming, which next semester we kind of started all over with the case design and decided to encase it in epoxy resin. So instead of having a case that you assemble, you'd assemble all the electronics and then put it inside a mold, pour the resin in, and it would harden around all the electronics. The downside to this is that once it's in there, you're not getting it out. So it makes testing kind of harder, because with the other case, you could just open it up, take the sensor or electronics out if you needed to rewire something, reprogram something. But with this, once it was in there, there was no rewiring, no reprogramming, which is why we never got around to actually encasing one of these. We did some tests with encasing a model of it, but we didn't actually get to encase our actual circuit during the semester because we had a lot of delays with electronics being shipped to us. So we only got all of our materials the very last week we were working on the project.
So did you look at other GPS trackers for other animals to kind of get an idea of how to start? Okay.
Well, especially existing one for sea turtles we looked at.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, we looked at those, especially for determining how we were going to actually send the data for this. We ended up going with a system that connects to the Argos satellite network, which is a satellite network created by NASA, NOAA, and the French Space Agency, with the goal of using it to monitor the environment and wildlife. So we read that and we're like, yeah, this fits right in.
Yeah. You mentioned it having to be cost effective. How did you guys make sure it was cost effective when so many trackers are so expensive? What were some of the challenges behind making it more cost effective than other trackers?
The biggest part was, in both expenses and power, was again that satellite transmitter. That was almost half our budget, and finding a way to do that as cheaply as possible helped us out quite a bit. We ended up finding a chip for it online. That was only about $50, as opposed to some that were going for $200-300. So yeah, our goal was to kind of keep it below the $500 range, and we did for the design that we have.
Looking to the future, is there any potential for someone else to pick up this project and actually get it to the stage where you could get
Definitely
the monthly subscription and everything?
Definitely. In fact, I was talking with the team, close, and during that last week when we were rushing to get everything together, and we were all like, yeah, if we had like 2-3 more weeks, we'd get so much farther.
Really? Wow.
We were that close.
Yeah.
Because our next step would have been encasing it and having a fully functional prototype.
You did have a prototype with the first one, right? That was too boxy.
Yes.
But that was kind of like proof of concept.
Yes. It wasn't fully sealed. It didn't have all of the sensors we wanted it to. And I would not have expected that thing to last more than a few days underwater at most. That was another problem with that design, was not being able to vacuum form it. I had to by hand melt the edges of the plastic together. So if I didn't get a perfect like seam on those, we would have had water leakage. We didn't see any when we were doing our testing, but we tested for 30 minutes compared to 6 months to a year that it would actually need to stay underwater.
Yeah.
It was a good proof of concept to show that we could put all the electronics together, we could put all the sensors together, we could make something that transmits data when it's above water, but it really needed a lot more work after that first semester. But I really think the design we came up with at the end of the second semester has real potential, that you could just follow it from where it left off and in at least a semester have a prototype ready to field test.
That's awesome. Do you know if anybody has picked up the project, or have you heard about? I know I've heard some talks about a new professor at UD picking it up that was an engineering professor.
Oh, I haven't heard about that.
Okay.
I know there was interest with TurtleUp extending it with another capstone team. Because I think their plan was originally, they originally only had it as a 1 semester project. But then extended it to the 2 semesters, which unfortunately everyone working on it graduated. So it would have to be
college projects, huh?
Yeah, it would have to be picked up by another team. But I did try to leave like an instruction manual pretty much for whoever picks it back up on, here's our design, here's how you build it starting from scratch. The materials you need to order, the processes, the steps involved, all of it.
One of the interns this summer actually has that manual, and that's how
I know I sent it to someone.
Yeah. So it's definitely still being used by TurtleUp. So I hope soon somebody else will pick it up. Maybe this year another capstone group will pick it up.
Yeah, I'd expect if it does get picked up, it'd probably be in the fall.
Yeah. Going back to the testing and everything, how did you go about testing a sea turtle tracker like this? Did you like put it in a tank of water and just let it sit for a little bit?
With our our first semester prototype, we did test it underwater a bit. We actually couldn't seal it, so we didn't fully submerge it. But the second semester, we didn't get a chance to test it underwater because we hadn't encased it yet. Because the epoxy resin takes a day to a day and a half to cure fully, and we were still testing sensors to get them all operational Friday before our presentation. I kid you not, 10 minutes before we went to give our final presentation, we were sitting there in the capstone lab area, trying to figure out our connections on the circuit board and get it all working.
Wow. Yeah. What were all of the sensors that you guys had on it? I know you mentioned pressure and then the satellite link.
Yes. We had a pressure sensor, a light sensor, temperature sensor, and an accelerometer to be able to determine speed changes and acceleration, that kind of thing. Also, something interesting about the satellite network is that there are actually 2 ways with this to determine location. And we, for a while, considered cutting the GPS sensor out of the design entirely, because what the Argos satellite network does is it uses the Doppler effect to, if you send multiple transmissions to it in a short period of time to one satellite, it determines the relative velocity of the tracker to the satellite And from that, knowing the satellite's position, it can determine the position of where the signal's being sent from.
So why didn't you decide to cut the GPS?
Accuracy, and we wanted a backup. Because determining the location from Argos requires that multiple transmissions be sent in a short amount of time. So if you only get one transmission in, or two even, it might not be enough to fully determine that location. And even then, if you do get enough transmissions to fully determine that location, because instead of using the delay in a signal from GPS, it uses one satellite, while GPS uses 3 to triangulate. It has a bit of location inaccuracy. I think the margin of error under ideal conditions was like 500 meters, where with GPS, it's half a meter.
Yeah, so a lot more accurate.
Yep.
So it's essentially just having fail-safe over fail-safe over fail-safe to make sure that it lasts for a full year.
And that was kind of my design philosophy that I think the whole team kind of worked with was, how do we build this thing so that even if some of the sensors are offline, some things don't work, we lose battery power, something like that, it will still work. Designing something that will work even if half the components fail, which we did have solar power on it as well to serve as a backup and supplemental power supply. So if the batteries do run out, we would still have some power to maybe get a transmission or two out, or to help us stretch that battery life as long as we can.
And then I wanted to ask about the light sensor. What was the reason for adding that?
We were looking at ways to, this also reminds me, I forgot to mention a sensor. Mm-hmm. We had a conductivity sensor as well. The light sensor, the conductivity sensor, and the pressure sensor all played into determining whether or not the turtle was underwater. So if we got a high light reading, a very low pressure reading, and a very low conductivity reading, all three of those combined mean the turtle's above water, which is also goes into those having backups. So if one of those sensors isn't available or is giving faulty data or something, it can still make that decision of when to transmit, because it needs to only transmit while on the surface. Because of how much battery those transmissions consume, we need to do those as few as possible and maximize the potential that those transmissions actually get to a satellite. So that was the main purpose of that light sensor. Okay. The conductivity sensor actually functions off the fact that seawater conducts electricity, so it would be able to tell if the turtle were fully submerged or in the air. Well, not in the air, but on the surface.
If it was in the air, some sensors messing up.
Yeah.
What would you say was your favorite part of the project? Like, was there one part of it that you thought was really fun or interesting that you really enjoyed?
Honestly, probably that last week.
Just because everything was coming together.
Getting all of our stuff in and actually being able to start putting things together. Because for a while we just felt like we were just waiting. You know, we had done all the programming we could do without having it there. We'd done all of the theorizing and stuff that we could do without having a prototype to test, and we were just waiting on the circuit board to be delivered. Once we got that and started soldering things together and testing things, it was one thing after another, you know. Every couple hours, there'd be a text from one of us, hey, I got the pressure sensor working, or we got the temperature sensor working, or the GPS is accurate, you know. One of those things, you know, that we could cross off our list in such a short span of time.
I'm sure that was really satisfying to see all of the work from the previous 2 semesters in a matter of hours coming together.
Yeah. Because even earlier that week, we were having problems with the operating system of the board.
Oh, really?
Yeah. We eventually found out the cause was the pressure sensor. The circuit board has 4 places it connects, and they're in like a little square, 1, 2, 3, 4. Well, when they were laid out on the circuit board, we were looking at the back of the pressure sensor diagram, you know. So the back of it has those in a different order than the front, because when you actually put it on the board, you're looking at the front. So what it was doing was creating a short connected to the CPU. So every time we tried to use that pressure sensor, it would short out the CPU, shut the whole thing down. And we thought we just had a completely non-functional board for a day.
I'm sure that was stressful.
Yeah. We eventually did figure it out. So
theoretically, once you had the whole thing all together, the tracker, the epoxy's dry and everything, did you guys plan out how you would go about connecting it to a sea turtle, like actually placing it on one?
yeah, this it would be the same method used for current sea turtle trackers, which is essentially gluing it to the turtle shell.
Okay.
Using epoxy, and I think they use a sheet of fiberglass. I'm not entirely sure. To actually bond it to the turtle shell so it stays on. But yeah, we didn't get to that phase yet with the testing, but
yeah. As someone who is a biology person, hearing about people making a cheaper way to track stuff, is really cool, because it makes it a lot more accessible to do good research, which is very important.
Yeah, a lot of the trackers we were looking up, when we were trying to do research, they were listed at like $5,000 to $8,000 a piece.
Yeah.
And
wildlife trackers are expensive.
We could go and design something for $500 that, although that's not counting all of the like labor time to assemble it, and that's just the materials. But if you're working with a nonprofit, maybe you could get somebody to volunteer. I don't know. I don't know about all the budget and that stuff.
It's still a lot more affordable than 5,000, that's for sure.
Yeah.
And I mean, if you're researching for an institute, there's grants and things like that. So there's plenty of ways to be able to get funding for something like that. It's just $5,000 is hard to get funding for, when 500 sounds a lot better.
Yeah. And being able to, even if you have that amount of money, being able to deploy 10 trackers instead of one.
Yeah, it's a really cool project for sure.
Yeah, I really enjoyed working on it. I mean, I'm glad I picked it as my senior capstone project.
Well, I think that's all the time we have today. Thank you so much, Austin, for having a great conversation and for all the work you've done for TurtleUp. Now, before we go, I have another turtle fact for all of the viewers. Sea turtles practice what is called temperature-dependent sex determination, which means that incubating sea turtle eggs become male or female based on the temperature of the egg chamber. This is fairly common in reptiles and is something researchers are studying closely due to global warming. You see, rising temperatures might result in a bias towards one gender or another, leading to there being too many males or females and not enough of the other to breed. With today's sea turtle fact out of the way, it's time to end. I'd once again like to thank Austin for coming on today, and thank you all for watching. If you liked what you saw, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe so you can catch the next episode of TurtleUp Podcast. Until then, keep exploring, don't stop asking questions, and make new discoveries.